And
Today's day.
I think I can share my screen for the online.
You want to share that?
Can you share? Oh, perfect. Ooh. Awesome. Now we're getting started, everyone. Sorry about that. Sorry, everyone in here as well. But yeah, it's very, very nice to have you here. Today, we're going to talk about leading schools and sustaining innovation, an interview with Luke Roberts, who is here. And thank you very much for being here, Luke. It's a pleasure to be able to do this interview in person and to be talking about very important topics that we need to discuss and bring more to the surface so more people can have access to it, right? So thank you very much for being here. And thank you our in-person audience and our online audience as well. This is just a bit of context. This is an event part of the Systems Innovation London Hub, which is a hub for systems thinkers and practitioners in London to be able to connect and share best practices and ideas. And the Systems Innovation Network is an international global network, and we here are the hub in London for explaining and sharing ideas across the globe. But we have other hubs as well. We have Bangalore hub in India. We have Lisbon hub in Portugal. We have several other hubs there doing more or less the same thing, but of course in that context. And we have thematic hubs as well, which are more online versions of these hubs, but talking about specific themes like education, sustainability, organizations, and bringing the complexity, science, and systems thinking to these topics. So this is the London Hub core team. Joss Colchester, who's going to be here soon. He's organizing another event right now, but he's the representative of the London Hub. Then we have Mrinali, who is here supporting us with the tech and everything. So very grateful for you being here as well, Mrinali. Me, part of the London Hub, and we have Kirsten, who just joined as well. And yeah, it's been very, very good to have her joining the team. So this is a bit about us, and yeah, just a bit of the nutshell about the London Hub. Collaboration Hub focused on bringing awareness, understanding, and initiating collaborations to help address critical and complex issues with the help of systems innovation, locally, regionally, and globally as part of the SI network. And these are a couple of activities that we do, normally learning these ideas, as you mentioned here, the content that are available on the website. We try to bring different ways in which people can actually understand these ideas, connecting a bit of what we're doing here, sharing, getting to know new people, having this space to see that we're not alone. We can have this conversation with like-minded individuals, and then creating with real-world projects, co-creations, and so on, labs, and ways to apply these ideas as well. And these are a couple of the meetups that we had before. We've been doing this for 2 years and so on. So there's a lot of different opportunities to engage with other people, either online and in person. But today we are doing this hybrid, right? And we are going to welcome Luke, our guest speaker today, who just a bit about Luke's background. Luke has spent over 20 years in the conflict resolution and restorative practice field, with working with schools, prisons, policy, charities, and communities to address conflict and bullying situations. This led him to create Resolve Consultants Limited to explore how to transform conflict into peace, which is a topic that we discussed a bit in our last session online as well. In 2023, he began working in the USA as he became founder and chief operating officer for High Five Schools to address violence and increase connection to schools communities. And Luke is a visiting lecturer at Cambridge University and the Royal College of Art. He's the author of Leading Schools in Sustaining Innovation, How to Think Big and Differently in Complex Systems. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. Great. So this is Luke's book. I left the QR code there for you to access. We have a discount code for everyone that is here and online as well. A good opportunity to get the book because I definitely recommend it. And yeah, we can get started then. So that's it for introduction.
Yeah.
Cool. So the first question that I have here, oh yes, and please everyone online, use the chat to address any questions that you'd like. We are going to pick up some questions there and you here as well. Yeah, we're going to have some faithful for that. So for us to just get things started, I think it's always good to understand a bit more of the background of the speaker so we can understand a bit more about where the book came from. But if you could share with us, yeah, a bit of your context, your background, and what made you inspired to create this book.
Okay. Thank you, Yasmin. I think what inspired me to create the book, well, my PhD, number one, having done the research, I was told too academic, make something much more practical for people to read and engage with based off of your research. So that's why the book came about. But I think behind that is the challenge that I saw was a lot of organizational models for me weren't working. And so where we, in education, they talk about like the whole school approach in the UK, whole prison approach, whole organizational approach. And I used to work in local authority many moons ago and be like, we just need to get everyone trained and then everyone will be doing the thing that we need them to do. And I started to realize after about 3 or 4 years that that wasn't the case. And it's not enough to say, well, is it the individual that is the problem or is it the change model itself? And so I started to challenge the change model and kind of go, what are alternatives out there? And in my own research, I kind of showed that for education, at least, most initiatives tend to last 3 years and they hit a cliff edge, they just die. Or they become co-opted by the system and they become less than what they could be. So I wanted to find a concept that could bridge beyond 3 years, be able to say, if we're truly interested in sustainability, what does it take at the organizational leadership level to hold on to the things that we value most beyond that cliff edge kind of thing? So for me, that's where this idea of complex systems really started to grab my attention and kind of go, there's something in it. A lot of the literature felt quite dense to begin with. But as you kind of start to read it and start to go, right, actually, how can I apply this? Then I found it invaluable. And it's kind of like, it's the concept that I enjoy the most because I've applied it in so many settings now. When people get it, it really unleashes their creativity, but it's just helping them understand why it's so valuable.
Yeah, it unlocks that new way of thinking, right? That they thought it was impossible before, but then brings a new perspective.
I think, what is it? That often people are caught in their system. And so all you can see is how things are. And until you see it as a system and see its potential for change, that's where you can really start to unleash potential. And so like one of the most challenging systems is the prison system in the UK. Very much in love with the status quo, and like we don't change unless we're absolutely forced to. So even though they had video conferencing 10 years before the pandemic, it was the pandemic that got them to actually use video conferencing because the need was there. So the innovation existed long before the ability for them to do it. And so for me, kind of getting them to see and getting organizations to see how when you start to see things as a system, you start to recognize the power of your history, but also the power of the potential of the present and what the trajectory is into the future. That is very exciting. But again, very few people have that conversation because often they're told what's the target, what's the outcome, what's the output, and we reduce complexity and then we're surprised.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So before going a bit deeper into the application of it, what made you interested in complexity, in complex adaptive systems, and yeah, what made you curious about that?
I think it was just thinking, it was knowing that I'd got it so badly wrong with my change management ideas, and that what I'd helped perpetuate was, how can I put it, was something that's just going to frustrate people. If they're looking for genuine, meaningful change, I was an advocate kind of going, no, you need to look at, your theory of change model. You need to look at how you're going to change the organization, change your policy, change your training, and going, that isn't enough. And if that's not enough, what could really make a difference? And so when I first started out, I thought like complexity would solve all. Like, we just need to think complex systems. And during my PhD, I was told, Luke, it's either an intervention or it's an analytical model. Which one is it going to be? So I decided it's an analytical model, because you can draw on other types of systems thinking to enact change. But the difference is, if you're looking through the lens of complexity, you then hopefully don't fall into the trap of going back into a mechanistic mindset. So you can do all the great complexity of systems thinking in the world, but you'll still end up with an action plan, a RAG-rated kind of strategy, and therefore you've just probably wasted a lot of your own time and everybody else's, because you could have just done that at the beginning. So it's, how do you hold on to these ideas beyond the nice discussion and the excitement, to go like, how do we apply this in the real world? So for me, complexity theories, I did the literature review and analyzed it. I just felt like there was so much that kind of aligned with our ways of being in the world that are much more kind of nature orientated as well. And so there's a lot that you can learn from systems through nature, but also what do we embody and what do we want to embody when we're thinking about being in systems as well.
Wow, I really resonate with that. Yeah, I think we're just starting to put ourselves in this more, like, wouldn't say artificial, but as you're saying, the nature outside has a lot of the responses in a way that we need, and sometimes it's just being a bit more observant of that.
I think I'd go further than that. I would say that, within biological natural systems, there are rhythms, there are intelligences, there are patterns that we have become disassociated from because of mostly our mechanistic mindset of, we have to produce to be successful, to see growth. And within that disconnect, it means that we're now encountering a lot of the problems of like the challenge of a capitalist extractive economy. And so how do we build things that will be sustainable, not in the next 20 years, but in the next 100 years? So like my son, for example, is 2, my daughter is 9. I'm very invested in the future. Like, I need to know that what's going to be better for them is going to be, things that we've contributed to. So from that perspective, I think that's where we have to look at, the things, the rhythms of nature tell us how things can sustain themselves for a very long period of time. Capitalism is a concept that's only like 200, maybe 300 years old. But already its destructive elements of it are things that we seem to become normalized or accepted in systems. And part of that is because we stopped seeing systems.
Wow, that's powerful. Well, I think, yeah, we're going to come back to these ideas as we go along. But then what is the main question that you think, the main question or questions that the book kind of helped you answer? Or, yeah, what was the previous curious ideas that you had to then bring the book to life, or having the book as a medium to kind of answer this question?
Oh, wow, that is a question. I think, number one, it's avoiding the trap of tokenism. So saying we're going to do things, and like I kind of give this metaphor, like you can have like, your inclusive icing, your trauma-informed icing, your sustainability icing, where if the cake itself is punitive, extractive, destructive, all we've done is put a really nice veneer on that structure. And I think that's the danger of tokenism. And you can fall into that very naturally, particularly when you have leaders who are like, I'm new, I need to prove myself, I want to be seen to be doing something. But again, because it's always very short term, because the system itself, the mechanistic system perpetuates urgency, the need to do something now. We then get caught in that tokenistic trap. So then we put on a pedestal leaders who are seen to be able to instigate change in 18 months, 12 months. The fact that the system doesn't change is irrelevant, because that person now embodies what we think is success. And so for me, hopefully the book is asking leaders to step back from that and go, if you're really interested in changing the systems, the communities, the models of learning that you want for your young people, it has to be beyond you. And so how do we start to think in that systems way where ultimately what you help contribute to now will be sustainable beyond you, beyond your generation of people who are working in that system.
Wow. And don't know if everyone is familiar with this idea of tokenism. Would you like to explain a bit more on that?
Okay, I've been really asked to explain tokenism, Yasmin. So tokenism means that, basically you're looking at something, you're perpetuating a fad, a fashion, an idea, a concept, an artifact, and saying that this is something that has authentic, genuine meaning. But after a while, it becomes really apparent that either it's temporary, it decays, people move on. So you did just enough at that moment in time to appease whoever was saying like, this needs to change, we need something to be different. But the long term is, it doesn't. And this is where you get, change fatigue, community fatigue, with lots of initiatives being thrown, because people have to make a choice when they're dealing with change, which is, can I trust you to stay with this? And so organizations become resilient to change, because if you've got a lot of churn at the top, a lot of leaders coming in with new ideas, but everyone's gone within 18 months, then of course you're going to wait. And one of the great things is when you look at systems approaches, people will wait you out, because they know if you can get to 3 years, it's probably not going to be around. So did I need to invest in it in the first place? And if I've got a career in an organization that's 15, 20 years, I don't need to participate here. I have to wait and see where genuine change is going to come from. So the tokenistic aspect is not always intentional, but it is something that comes across when people in their organizations or in their communities have seen the change and seen the promise and the failure of that promise to occur.
Interesting. And it happened in these cycles that are just repeating themselves, and then there's something that is sustaining these repetitions as they go along.
Well, to some extent, if you think about, like, take lots of big organizations, what does it take to get to the top of them? And the lifespan of the CEO or of the leader is getting shorter and shorter. So what does that tell you about the pressure that leaders are under to be seen to making change happen? So the urgency in the system co-ops leaders themselves, like, I've got to make sure that these shareholders get their value, these stakeholders see that I'm progressing on X, Y agenda. And because of that, if I don't, well, then I'm gone. So I need to do big things, dramatic things now, and hopefully in 18 months I'm still about. So the leaders, part of the challenge with leadership is the short-termism of leadership is contributing to the tokenism that we're experiencing in organizations and communities.
All right, yeah.
And my argument would be, it's because we stopped thinking in systems.
Yeah, as you're saying, right, we just focus on the next thing, in the next moment. We're not thinking about the consequences of this action in a bigger, larger scale, and then we just keep repeating these patterns and bringing people into this value model.
Well, so we'll put it into two kind of perspectives here. So if we think about, for example, lots of leadership churn, that can be really demoralizing for an organization, because suddenly who owns the purpose of that organization? Is it me, or is it the people I'm looking up to make that happen? But also as a consequence of that, the customer, the user, person who's experiencing what should be the deliverables of that organization kind of goes, well, can I trust you anymore? Because you're going to change from Coke to classic Coke to diet. They did that at one point. But again, it's really easy to start going, well, look at the individuals. But the point is, look at the system that's perpetuating, as you rightly say, the change that's occurring. And if that continues to occur, it's the system's feature. So then who calls that out? Like, one of the big things that's happened in the UK is the post office scandal that we've got at the moment. And so, everyone's looking like, who should we blame? But is anybody like calling out the management theory? Because the artifacts that were created through this technology meant a lot of people put their faith in the technology and stopped listening to the people. And so again, what was going on in terms of management theory and management concepts that enabled leaders to see that way, to think that way? And the same thing applies in education as well. At the moment in the UK, we have loads of children being excluded from school because the argument would be like, their behavior doesn't fit the model of education that produces the educational results. But as a consequence of that, we're discarding a lot of children, and that's normalized. Like we can say now, what is it? I think it's something like let's say like 200,000 children are temporarily excluded and a smaller number is permanently excluded. But that's acceptable now. That's normalized. Like we can say, okay, so we just write off parts of our potential future because they don't fit a particular model.
Yeah. Wow, a lot, a lot on that. I just like to ask, does you like to ask any questions right now, or do you have any questions in the chat, Ronali? No? Any questions here?
So your PhD, your PhD wasn't on schools or was on schools?
It was on schools, but how can I put it? It just came about systems after a while. Like you start to see complex systems and you kind of go, right, does that framework work? And if it works in schools, and one of the things that I was very fortunate to say was that post PhD, I was then asked by like the NHS to do some work in the health system, and I was asked by the Department for Rural Affairs to look like. And what started to occur to me was that what people are interested in is help me understand the complexity of my system. And once you've got the framework for that, I'm not a content specialist, but I can tell you how I expect a complex system to start behaving as you tell me about the context of your system. So this is where I started off in schools, but I've then metamorphosized, for want of a better word, into just like I see systems. Like in one of my lectures, they were like, do you just see systems like the Matrix everywhere? And I'm like, yeah, I pretty much do actually now. So
Your point about politics or short-termism, how do you recommend if you're advising a politician? Easy to do a big shiny thing, but actually, in order to address the systemic issues, they need to do the hard yards. How do you, so is there an overlap between the things that are shiny and exciting for politicians versus the necessary threat of this thing?
I think I'll reject the premise of the question, if I may. So what I would say is that actually, if you engage with systems, what you're likely to get is things that are not just shiny and new, but creative, insightful, and meet local need. The problem that you get is the concertina effect of we want general, all-encompassing services. No, we want really localized niche service. And so if we've got our politicians to be educated much more as systems thinkers, they would see that the thing that they're really after is not just a new shiny thing to make a big splash, but what's the legacy you want to leave behind? And that seems to get lost, again, going back to Yasmin's earlier point, in the electoral cycle that in the UK seems to be speeding up. We get lost in terms of the ability to think about legacy, because each new politician wants their new shiny thing to woo the electorate with. Whereas if we stood back and go like, are people in the UK happy with their health system at the moment? The answer is probably no, and it's going to require a longer term change than an electoral cycle to make that happen. So this is where we do need to think much more around, if we had a systems approach, and there's some really creative ideas in the NHS, for example, they're just killed all the time because it's not in anyone's interest sometimes to make innovation happen, because everyone's career paths are based on, can you deliver this month, this year, target outcomes, etc. Did that help? I think I'm an optimist. I'm always an optimist. So I think the thing around like networks like this is about how can we use these ideas to galvanize people, because when you start to apply complexity, and I have done this in the NHS, there's some really insightful, thoughtful ideas about what could be done, but those ideas are curtailed because the conditions of the system don't support innovation. Right?
Yeah, sure.
I think just what you were saying, but kind of expanding on this, and it's so incredible. And I'm always thinking about like how, what are the ways to deal like with this natural low progress that happens on a complex system, and how can we put together, keep them engaged? Because as we're just saying, like people want to see the new now, but we know this is a different way of thinking. And what I would like to speak to here, like if you have another example of how you bring them along, an example that you see, like the small, how you measure the very small changes and the progress.
Ooh, okay, ask the hard question. So there's two parts to that. So I think how do people get to participate in the systems is number one. So often, what's like government organizations tend to take the cheapest way. So do we do a survey, for example? But that doesn't necessarily mean your voice is captured in a way that's meaningful to you and the system you'd like to influence. So again, what are the ways in which we can creatively engage people in having their voices heard in systems is number one. And I think that's, I've done stuff with like artists, for example, to map out, to draw, to engage. And I've actually had people write poetry in response to the art. So the narrative has changed. The experience of change has changed because we've applied it in a different way. So I think, again, being as creative as you can to engage communities and stakeholders, number one, really important. And then the bit that you've mentioned there is about how do you measure the beat of the butterfly's wings? Because the long-term effects of those butterflies flapping will have massive systems change. And I guess that's where you've got to be system sensitive. So this is where, again, the models of evaluation that are input, output, outcome are not sensitive to systems change. And so how do we start to, again, be creative by asking people, engaging people? What would be something that would be different to you? Like just the changing the color of the wall, signify a different change. Hearing different language in the system, does that signify change? What is the smallest beat that the people in the system with the lived experience can feel that the system is starting to change? And I'd go after that.
Cool. We just go there and then we come back to you. So how much feedback has to play a role in sustaining innovation? We have a lot of questions there. Is there trust in delayed feedback, or everyone is addicted to quick fixes because of the addiction to immediate feedback? This is what I'm observing in IT industry.
So feedback is essential, and there are three forms of feedback, I would argue, in complex systems. So what amplifies in the system? So how does energy produce a network effect to influence more and more nodes, actors in the system? Regulatory feedback. So how does the system regulate itself so that it doesn't like explode through amplification? And then the final one is no feedback as a form of feedback. So that was the hardest one for me to think through in my own research, which is if the system is not doing what you want it to do, it's telling you something. So you have to see the absence of action as action in systems, if that makes sense. So once you get your head around that, feedback is essential to any form of complex system. And then I think in terms of the specific question, I think there will always be lags in the system because systems, in my mind, in complex systems, time is relative rather than linear. So depending on what you do influences me, influences somebody else. So I'm not measuring the linearity of a straight arrow of time. I'm measuring interactions in the system, and that's different. And I think in terms of the quick fixes, I saw a really interesting article between dopamine and serotonin. So dopamine is that quick hit, oh, I feel great, I'm gonna eat some chocolate, where serotonin is like, I'm happy with my life kind of thing. So we are being geared more and more towards dopamine hits to give us what we think is a sense of joy, and rather than the serotonin of like, actually, I can be content with the way in which change is happening around me. So I think the quick fixes feel like the dopamine hits, like this is what we'll do to keep you happy now, as opposed to are you happy in your career? Are you happy with the mission of this organization and the challenges we're facing? So there is a system psychology at play there.
Wow, nice, powerful. Yes.
Thank you. So my question is, you spoke about that we don't think in systems. Do you think that is because people don't see themselves as part of a system? And if that's the case, maybe why not?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think if I can answer it in several parts, I think intuitively when we're young, we do think in systems, and we are educated out of that. We are taught that the ways in which to be analytical are to deconstruct the system. And in deconstructing system, you lose the system behavior. So it's the equivalent of like, Yasmin chopping off my arm and going, let me tell you about Luke's personality. Like you've looked at a part of the system to try and describe the whole. So that might work in some aspects, but not all. So I think the way in which we educate, we tend to lose systems thinking. The other part of it, I'd also say, is the way in which we can think about systems. I quite like the idea of games and play, and the spaces for play and the spaces for games in the world of working in communities are really about interactions. So how do we interact? So we can take anything to the game. One of my favorite books is Bernard Suits' The Grasshopper, and he's just talking about how to define a game. And in defining a game, all I hear is systems are interactive. They are dependent on the variables that the players use. And so again, there are certain things that, you know, as you broaden your definition of systems, other things might be part of it that we probably go, no, that sounds like it should be part of this tribe or this academic field of systems thinking. Whereas I think there's loads of systems experiences out there, but we just don't call it that anymore. And so I hope we can revitalize, reinvent education in a way that allows people to really benefit and intuitively benefit from being systems thinkers. Does that help? Does that answer the question?
I mean, what you say is obviously very informative and interesting. I guess I'm just interested in the idea that perhaps at the end of the 20th century, as we progress toward more confident articulations for individualism, we see ourselves less as being part of something that has a structure. And so from a broader societal sort of perspective, we don't really think about ourselves as being part of the system. I think there's also a confusion because I think when people who are not interested in how established systems think about systems, they're thinking about more mechanistic things, you know, whether it's kind of, you know, a configuration of a sporting team or the way military exercise might work, or, you know, something that's very kind of, you know, constructive and mechanistic and linear. So I think there are two different issues, but I think they sort of intersect.
Yeah, I think you're right. So like, sometimes we're talking about boundaries. So where do you draw the boundary? So are you a brain in a body, or do you see yourself as a body? Like where you draw the boundary then tells me like where people perceive their agency to be. So when we say we're individualistic, do I see myself as separate from my family? Do I see myself as separate from my workplace? Like it's about where those boundaries lie. So I think taking your point, like the 20th century consumer was, what is it that you need? The customer's always right. And in doing so, we then feel disconnected from others. And so like in America last year, I was reading an article by the general surgeon, which saying America's a more isolated society than ever. And again, where have people been told that those boundaries exist and whether they draw them for themselves as well? So again, part of the bit around thinking in systems is around playing with the boundary, saying, well, what happens if we remove it? What does that change in the system because of that? And that can apply to us as much as our communities and organizations.
Wow. Oh, any other questions on the chat? No. Cool. Yeah, so I think it relates to a lot of the topics that we've been talking about as well. But there's in chapter 4 of your book, you talk about energy and energy in systems, and this is, I think, very fascinating concept to kind of bring to life because it might help kind of addressing some of these questions about the boundary and how, you know, things actually come about and so on, incentives and why people do what they do. So yeah, what is this energy concept that you bring and how is it important in the concept of?
Yeah, everyone seems to like chapter 4 in particular. Oh yeah, chapter 4 is really good. So well, again, it went back to this point about no feedback as a form of feedback. So it was kind of like explain the absence of something. Mm-hmm. So how do you explain the absence of something? I was looking for a concept. I ended up watching something around physics and dark matter. And I was like, oh, you know, they're looking for something they can't measure, can't see. And so how do you know it exists at all kind of thing? And I was thinking, if I apply the same kind of logic to social systems, there is a social energy. So social energy has to move around the system. So if I want to enact change, so if I want to enact a change around, you know, addressing violence or addressing climate change, where is the social energy that makes that happen? And if it's not there, it means the system is doing something else with that energy. So the absence of energy tells you what the system is not interested in. And so once you see that and you can get your head around it, you start to go, right, now we have to think about flows. How do I help energy flow around the system? Or how does energy flow through me? in ways that I may not want as well? So am I being co-opted by the system as well? So I kind of came up with this triangle of attention. So like, where do people literally put their attention? Then what is the information that they're focusing on? And I put money as well, because we kind of live in capitalist system. So money can buy information, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee your attention. And so once you start to play with these three concepts, it tells you where energy is. So like, you know, I can give you a lot of attention, but probably not much information comes from it, or money, you know, like, but and so you can start to go, right, the three are constantly intertwining and playing with, you know, each other, that creates this form of social energy. And so then when you're thinking about the change you want to bring about in the system, how do you use the three individually and collectively to bring about meaningful change? So when I was working in the prison service, lots of the things that I would see, I'd be like, oh, why is that there? And everyone goes, we didn't even notice it. And it might have been there for like years for all I know, but like, no, like people become organizationally blind. So how do you help them see? And so this concept of social energy became really useful to me, to be able to say, if I'm thinking about change and I want to see how change can be enacted, how are the people I'm trying to work with empowered to use social energy to create change for themselves? And if it's not happening, that becomes the boundary that needs to be played.
Okay, so if we, for example, is it possible to bring all of these together, but not in the same, let's say, power, bringing attention, information, and money, all of them together to maybe enable change?
So let's do it on a small scale first of all. So if you've got an initiative in a school, like you want to bring in, excuse me, like trauma-informed practice, you know, like children who are traumatized need additional support. So there might be really strong evidence for that information, but it's in journals. So attention is boundaried and you have to pay for it. So you could hire a trainer to do trauma-informed practice for your staff. You're going to spend the money on the attention, but what's the quality of the training? So then how do you judge information on that one? So you can see how I'm playing with the three constantly. So we take it to something like on a bigger scale. So if we think about the climate crisis that's occurring at the moment, lots of attention, information is flowing, but is money flowing to the information to make the change that needs to happen? So there's that aspect. And then the second thing I would say is that what I find occurs a lot with leaders is often they come from a deficit model. So how do we get to, like, how do we have zero exclusions, zero people in, like, zero violence in prisons? And so this reductive measure is really hard to ever reach. Whereas you have to have like a strength-based approach, I would argue, which is like, rather than trying to reduce something in the system, what is it that you want to amplify and increase? So rather than, and this is the work I did in prisons, was ultimately around how do you create peaceful prisons? Because how are you going to put your attention, your money, and your information into creating peace in prisons was a very foreign concept to a lot of leaders, because they're trained on like, how do I reduce something? So even the idea of getting to net zero doesn't tell me what you do want, it just tells me what you don't want. So tell me what 100% of something else looks like, and let's put the energy flowing towards that, and you may get a systems change.
Wow, nice, yeah. Cool. Well, any other questions from here, from the audience online? Cool.
I got lots of questions.
Wow. Okay. So you'd like to address it?
So, I mean, it seems to me you've just described entropy, which is physics. So, not to, so I've got two questions. One is, does it matter if people don't understand the systems that they're sort of participating in, provided their experience of the change is positive? And my second question is, you think about the characteristics that you would measure of a system that you're changing, and what characteristics do you think are important to be sensitive?
Okay, so taking the first one, I think it does matter if you're interested in long-term sustainable systems change, because otherwise you can, like, one of the dangers is you can medicalize people. Like, I can solve your problem because you don't know enough about it. And then that creates a power hierarchy of knowledge. Whereas if we're being co-constructed, co-designing together, you are instantly part of the conversation. So even if I leave, the knowledge still resides in you. So I think we always have to be careful about how we're claiming to create beneficiaries of the system if people don't get to participate in the change that's occurring. So I'm always very much around diversity in all forms matters in systems. The more, and diversity is a sign of a healthy system. So the more voices that can be heard and allowed to contribute to that system's change, I think the better. And then in terms of your second question, I don't ever actually say to people, what are the indicators of systems change? It has to come from you, because you've got the lived experience of the system.
So that wasn't quite
Okay.
It's more like for people who are interested in this, you know, what we're talking about today, like what characteristics of the system do you think we need to be sensitive to? As we sort of focus on change.
So then I'd say how you empower people is really important. What's the language we use to do that as well? So I'm always having to resist mechanistic language, being put on me. So Luke, can we come up with an action plan? Can we? I'm like, well, you might do, but actually, how have you understood the interactions that are happening in your system, first of all? And then I think you've also got to be aware of how, you know, things like evaluation can have a form of violence, a language of violence around them. So like, what's the impact we're making on that community? Well, that doesn't sound like you're going to be here for very long. Just so, you know, being mindful of language is really crucial. And I guess, you know, from my own perspective as well, like one of the things that I've really enjoyed is when I left the prison service, like maybe 4 years ago, I went back to do a piece of work 2 years ago. And this officer said, you know, we've got this thing called conflict resolution. It's really fascinating because it helps build peaceful prisons. And like, he didn't know that I was the originator of all of that. So he was like maybe 3 or 4 generations of people who've been trained since me. But he was explaining this concept to me. And I was like, this is just really fascinating. And I was genuinely interested because it showed like the knowledge had sustained beyond me. And so for me, that was one of probably the biggest indicators of success. That the ideas that I helped perpetuate had been kept alive in that system. So when people don't know that I'm part of it and they're still telling me that these things matter, that is probably one of like my personal marks.
And yeah, picking up on that, there's a part by the end of the book that you talk about sustaining innovation and not just enabling innovation, right? So this is, as you're saying, and as we're saying here, we sometimes are very worried about doing the next innovation and creating something else, but then what about sustaining it through a long period of time? And this is another conversation, right? So yeah, sustaining innovation. How did you get to this idea, and how do you think it's important for systems change and complexity?
So I think it goes back to my original point, which is if communities and organizations get change fatigue, they become really resistant to innovation and they want to wait you out. So if you're going to genuinely and authentically create meaningful change, you have to have your eye on how's it going to sustain beyond me. And I think this is where 2 things have to play out. So how does culture change because of the innovation that's being created? And then what's the story of that change that goes with that? So if you've got those 2 things, so we're back to our social energy in a different way here. So if the social energy is building the culture where people can see the change, feel that they've been part of it, and are genuinely committed to protecting it going forward, because there will be threats in the future to it, then you're onto a winner. But also it's about how you make sure that the story of that systems change is happening, because that in itself is part of the system, the narrative, the stories we tell. So when we have organizations that feel deflated, fatigued, you know, aggressive, defensive, victimized, you know, that's their present story. And a lot of managers will come in, going back to our original point, they'll come into kind of, oh, I'll change everything, but they don't change the narrative. And so the bit about the narrative change isn't that it comes from the leader. It's when it goes back to the point we just had, when other people are telling the story of their change, that's incredibly powerful. But it also does something else. It also sets the new experience in the system. And this is where I've seen things innovative that have been localized that I haven't expected. So emergence has occurred in the system at that point. And I've been like, wow, that's a brilliant idea. Like, I never would have thought about that. And I love it. And so how can we promote that? And so, and that's the empowering aspect. Like, once people recognize that you can have these creative emergent moments, they'll go after more, and the system will create more value, more amplification. And so again, it's just making sure you get the balance right between having enough innovation that helps perpetuate the sustainability of the good things you want, but not so much that you then end up with tokenism, pet projects, leaders trying to get, you know, their badges to move out. The conflict.
Yeah, is it possible to find that balance? How can you find that balance?
Well, again, it goes back to the premise, which is, are we thinking in a systemic way? Are we thinking about the systems? And so one of the challenges, and I think it goes back to the point that was made earlier, which is that the way in which mechanistic management thinking always tries to catch you in some way. And so you've just got to make sure I'm constantly making sure I don't fall into that trap. So sometimes people ask me questions, I'm just like, no, I can't do it, because I know where that trajectory will take me. And I know that language will be like, you know, can we rag rate it? Can we put it into some kind of matrix or metrics that can then be, you know, targetified? And then you've lost the benefit of the system.
Yeah, I think one thing is really understanding theoretically these ideas, and the other is really, as you're saying, embodying and making sure that other components of our everyday life is actually aligned to this idea as well. So our language, our ways of being, our attitude towards others, and so on, that needs to come in place so we can then enable systems change in a more pure way, or in a real sense.
Well, I think, what is it, Martin Luther King said, we are all part of a tapestry of humanity. And so, you know, what affects one directly affects all indirectly. And we tend to lose sight of that after a while. So again, it's about the recognition that, like, the actions we take today will have consequences for our networks, but also for the way in which the future trajectory of the system will start to emerge.
Yeah.
And with the concept of distributed resilience, thinking about like a little town that can be resilient in the face of all sorts of things happening to them, and not be too dependent on central government. And I'm kind of wondering what you think about resilience and systems change, because I thought with school, with the government, system change needs to be a top-down mandate, like I'm the headmaster, changing the system, and this is how it's going to be. I'm kind of wondering if you feel the system change and distributed resilience is sort of opposite or orthogonal or complementary, or how the two concepts sort of relate to each other.
Okay, well, that one's quite straightforward, actually. So one of the things that I talk about is network shapes. And so, like, the hub and spoke model is often the classic model of leadership, for example. And the problem with that, and this is one of the things that I learned in my master's, which was we had a very dynamic head teacher. And I said, I bet if she leaves, the whole change program she's going to put in place will collapse within 6 months. And of course, like, during the course of my research, she did leave. And I was like, wow, my research actually predicted, you know, like, that was going to happen, because the hub and spoke model is something that is often used as an implementation model, but it is not a change model that will have resilience in it or sustainability in it. So then it's not about the individual or the nodes in the network, it's about the network shape itself. And change the network shape, and you will change the way in which energy and information flows around it. And that will give resilience, if that's what you want. But it will allow that distributed network to be able to lose nodes, to be able to lose people, but retain the knowledge within it.
But on the other hand, if you go to the other side, everything is decentralized, then how does that, I guess you've got like swarms of apps that somehow like figure out how to be distributed but then change the system. But if you're very decentralized, do you really ever have a chance of bringing the bottom up?
I think I would say yes, because again, going back to our biomimicry in nature, you can have order without control. And so what we tend to do is, like, there's some leader who like goes, I can't handle the loss of control. And so therefore I don't trust those people, and those people don't feel that they are trusted. So then you generate conflict in the system. Like, we see this constantly within this kind of, you know, is it a national or is it a localized service? And the problem is no one's ever gone truly local, because there's never been enough trust in the system, in those people, long term enough. And again, I would say there isn't the flow of social energy to allow that to happen. So I can give you the attention and the information, but I won't give you the money. I'll give you the money, but I won't tell you how to spend it. And so therefore there is no regulatory forces. So then people go like, right, you know, what do we spend it on? So again, it's about finding these ways in which The resilience and the distribution of the network also has diversity in that network. So you might say, right, how do we have, in our local community, we might have the village people who've been there, X amount of generations, but who are those new people moving in? Do we need to have like architects, sustainability experts, aging experts, all of those people coming together to have the conversation, to make a richer conversation? My biggest danger I see is often monocultures. So you can have you can have the network shape, but if everybody is thinking the same in that network shape, then don't be surprised if you get the same types of outcomes time and time again. So it's about how we value the diversity of the network shapes and the diversity of the thinkers in those networks. Then I think you will have a truly resilient, distributed network.
But yeah, I think something that we discussed in previous sessions as well, with this diversity of thinking, then it brings some difficulties as well in terms of coordination and bringing the information to people and making it flow. Or I'm saying that, what are the downsides of this diversity as well, and how we could potentially use that in our advantage?
I think coordination is one aspect of it, and how we are connected. And again, one of the things I talk about is what's the weight of interaction between the nodes in the network. So that's basically like, how much do I trust you? How much do I like you? How often do we see each other? Is one aspect of it. And I think there's kind of like a second part, which is like, how does the network, or how does the system deal with conflict? And so we tend to we talk about complex systems, and when we get very academic and very theoretical, we don't talk about that the system is in conflict with itself. It's often in conflict with its environment. But actually, human beings tend to like power. And so we do have conflict in the system. And so what are the ways in which the system itself manages and addresses conflict becomes crucial. So like the English, I would argue, making a massive stereotype here, like very passive aggressive, we're not going to say it out loud. We'll probably say it somewhere different, And so whereas like when I work with people in the States, like they're just like, Luke, this is how it's got to be, like, much more like in your face about it. Like, oh, my English sensibilities, I can't handle this level of, So again, like, there's cultural conflict, but there's also like, how does the system itself engage with conflict? And it's so telling. So if there's a conflict that is pacified, so I remember I was working with one organization where everyone was so nice to each other, they never challenged anyone. And to the credit of the CEO, he said, like, we are losing value because we're not engaging with healthy conflict. We're not having the debates about, are there better ways out there? The moment someone suggests something, everyone goes, yes, great idea. And he goes, and that's not healthy either. So you can go from one extreme where you try to suppress all forms of conflict to the other extreme where you're just trying to accept and agree with everyone. And so again, it's how do you find that healthy balance within the system? Say that conflict can be very useful and the transformation of conflict, but violence is never helpful in the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Wow, lots of things to think about. I need to re-watch the recording because so much. So as we're getting closer to the end, I think maybe just reflecting about the book and of course the work that you've been doing so far. The main, let's say, 3 main lessons that you can
You'll never
share.
box me into that. Yeah, I mean, life is too complex. I can't simplify it.
A couple.
I think a reflection then would be, I think it feels like there is a movement happening in lots of places that we need to think in systems a lot more. And I think anybody who can contribute and amplify that conversation is going to be, part of that systems change and creating a new way of being in the world that is so urgently needed, because we're reaching a point where, for example, education is seeing more teachers retire, higher levels of teachers leaving the profession. And this, I'm using teaching as an example here, but across lots of various professions. And so it's not enough to just kind of go like, we need to do things faster, harder, or more expensively. We actually need to have new ways of thinking in the world now. And I think systems and complexity may not give the answer, but it can create the conditions for that answer to come about.
Nice. And yeah, if you could go back and start the project all over again, what would you change and what would you do differently? Well, what would you maintain and what would you do differently?
I don't know, like it was the path I walked, you know, so it came about that way. I think I was very fortunate because my 96-year-old gran was my coach, and she kept on going like, you know, don't just tell me about the theory, make it real, tell me what you did. And so having that level of coaching, and she was a systems thinker way before her time, so I'm very fortunate that the book has benefited from her coaching to make that happen. So I don't think I'd change a thing.
Nice. Great. Okay. Okay, so maybe last questions here before we go to the last question. Questions on the chat? No? Oh, good. Okay. So what comes next for you? What are the next steps in your research or in your curious journey, or what would you like to continue in this path?
I think I'm trying to test the idea so I can break the idea. And so the complexity framework that I've put together, I've tested like in prisons, in commercial sectors. And so I'm constantly kind of going like, where can I apply this to see where I don't think it works? Where I was like, I've missed something. So I'm continuing to do that. So that's one thing. When I was in America, I was asked about the school to prison production line. And they were like, what would you change? Because I have no intention of changing that system. I just want to break it. Like some systems need to die. And I think we need to be that honest in terms of saying like, not only does it not work, don't even try and, engage with it, kill it, find something better, work towards that. Goes back to my strength-based approach kind of thing. So I think having the confidence to be able to say like what things really aren't working at the moment, and how do we then like use our kind of moral and creative imagination to envisage different ways of being in the world. And then I think probably on a personal level, I think how to help young people in particular who still may be intuitive systems thinkers bring that into the workplace, to go like, how can we recognize that skill now and create the pathways, trajectories to allow them to be in the world as well. So like that's probably something that I'm quite passionate about, and kind of like I've met young people in very challenging circumstances and watched their energy and their charisma but not have the opportunity. So it's how do we make sure more young people have the opportunity to shine in the future?
These are the seeds of the future, right? So you need to.
I'm all about the future.
Yeah, water and kind of create the conditions for that to flourish. Awesome, awesome, cool. So any other topics or insights that you'd like to bring to the surface that we didn't have the opportunity to bring? Any last words that you'd like to leave with people?
No, I think they're probably all systems out to be honest right now. There's only so much you can take of it, but just a massive thank you for everyone bringing their social energy to this session. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate the opportunity to have my ideas shared with a wider audience, and it's the first time I've shared it with a network of systems innovators as well. So I was expecting like really tough questions, and actually everyone was really lovely and really engaged. So I appreciate that immensely.
Nice. Thank you very much. Cool, everyone. Thank you for being here. And yeah, this is the end of the questions, but I will give the discount code for you to get Luke's book, which again, recommend definitely. And yeah, just to close off our session, we have our next London Hub event coming up. Yes, this is about mapping the landscape of systems innovation in the UK. It's going to be a collaboration between the London Hub and the Bristol Hub, and we're going to try to bring other systems thinkers into the room to think about other systems innovation ideas that are out there that we are not aware of, that we can be a bit more aware and try to create more of these networks to for the information to flow and for us to be able to work together. So that's it. Thank you for joining. And
Yeah,
thank you very
no,
much for being here.
Thank you. Great.
Okay, that's it, everyone. Snacks. And there go. Okay.
So much.
Good, thank you. Thank you.
Social energy. I just, comment because I'm, one of the people that I will do before. But I'm just researching around like how we might be able to have to collective consciousness, which I think you kind of need social energy. To be able to increase this